Tonight, Hurricane Sandy coming ashore on the East Coast.
This is a massive storm.
One of the largest this country has seen. Thousands head to shelters, others ignore warnings to get out.
They are now in harm's way.
Trains stop, flights are grounded, and America's largest city closes down as the hurricane closes in. We'll have the latest forecast and correspondence up and down the coast.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley reporting tonight from Allenhurst, New Jersey.
And this is a special expanded edition. Good evening. Sandy is coming ashore. The hurricane is hitting the mid-Atlantic states as a Category 1 hurricane with winds of 75 miles an hour gusting up to 90. But the biggest story is probably not the wind, but the water. The hurricane is pushing a massive amount of water ahead of it all up and down the mid-Atlantic coast. From edge to edge, tropical force winds extend for 1,000 miles. An estimated 54 million Americans are in the path of the hurricane. The governors of 10 states, from North Carolina to Maine, have declared states of emergency. The biggest concern is the storm surge along the shoreline. It could push waters as high as 11 feet in New York Harbor and from 3 to 6 feet elsewhere.
No, man, we have to go home. It's a state of emergency.
Close to 1 million people who live along the shore are under evacuation orders. Streets in many low-lying areas are already flooded. Hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses from the Carolinas to Maine have lost power. More than 13,000 flights have been canceled. The federal government was closed today. So were the casinos in Atlantic City and just about everything in New York City. Subways, the stock market, even the Statue of Liberty, which, by the way, is built to withstand winds as high as 130 miles an hour. Off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, the Coast Guard rescued 14 crew members from the replica tall ship HMS Bounty. The ship was built for the 1962 movie Mutiny on the Bounty. It sank in the hurricane. 2 crew members are still missing. We have a team of CBS News correspondents all up and down the coast, but first, let's go to our hurricane consultant, David Bernard. David, what's the latest?
Good evening, Scott. The hurricane is crossing the Jersey shoreline tonight as a Category 1 storm with 90-mile-per-hour winds. All of the rain, though, is on the western side of the hurricane, and that has pushed well inland. It is dry on the eastern side, so the story on the west side of the storm is all about the heavy rain. When we look at the east side of the storm, though, that's where the stronger winds are going to come in. So far, we've had a wind gust in New York City to 66, Ocean City, Maryland, 56, and 59 is one of the highest ones observed in and around Atlantic City. But behind that comes enormous waves. There's where the hurricane is. We have 45-foot-plus waves well off of Long Island. All of this energy, all of these strong waves are being propelled toward Long Island and also the Jersey Shore. So the bottom line is we have a lot more hurricane to go, even though it's just now crossing the shore.
David, what are you expecting of the storm surge?
Well, the storm surge is going to be a real critical part of this storm. It's probably the most dangerous aspect of it. It seems like the most intense and dangerous areas are going to be the entire Jersey shoreline and also the Long Island Sound. That's where we could see the most devastating surges, but even areas beyond that, up to Massachusetts and south through the Carolinas and also parts of Virginia are going to see at least some surge from Sandy.
And what do you think that folks west of here can expect of this storm as the next few days transpire?
Well, when we look at the map, I think the big problem when we go into the inland areas are going to be floods. That's already occurring, river flooding, flash flooding, and then in the mountains of the Appalachians, particularly West Virginia, parts of western North Carolina, and western portions of Virginia State, we could be talking about blizzard conditions and snowfall totals of over 2 feet in some places.
David, thanks very much. Allenhurst, New Jersey is just south of the New York City area, but the eye of Sandy appears to be crossing very near Atlantic City, a little bit further down the coast from here. Jeff Glore is covering for us there.
Scott, we've been watching as this system came ashore very quickly here. The first hurricane making landfall in New Jersey in more than 100 years. As Sandy surge arrived with the morning's high tide, 80 sections of the city's famed boardwalk were swept away. Water poured into streets. Officials estimate 85% of this resort city is flooded. The 12 casinos had been ordered closed, and officials had issued an evacuation order for more than 30,000 residents. But not everyone left. By this afternoon, police tried to help stranded families.
How many people you got?
Including Robert Stevens, his wife, and 3 kids.
I will get the little guy in our truck.
Police put them in SUVs and dropped them at a nearby shelter.
It wasn't worth it staying. I would advise to get out. If you can get out, get out.
You got out.
Oh, yeah.
Family safe.
Yes.
Police told us some people do remain trapped, perhaps as many as 400. And as Hurricane Sandy continued to lash ashore, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie tonight lashed out at Atlantic City's mayor.
All I know is I did read him say that he didn't want his people leaving the city, that they would shelter in the city, despite the fact that the governor ordered the evacuation of his city and the closing of the casinos.
Scott, that rescue you saw may have been the last for now. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, emergency responders were told to stop that work and secure themselves.
Further down the coast, parts of Ocean City, Maryland are under 4 feet of water, and there's damage on the coastline. Chip Reed is there.
There's good reason that the low-lying neighborhoods of Ocean City, Maryland are under a mandatory evacuation order. Ferocious winds are whipping across flooded streets. Homes near the bay are taking a relentless beating, and on the ocean side, the surf is explosive. This was the Ocean City fishing pier yesterday. This is the pier today. Almost half of it is gone. Most have obeyed the evacuation order. The boardwalk is all but empty. But Diane Brott and Bill Seidel refuse to leave, despite the danger.
It's the most flooding I've seen in all the years I've lived here.
Now, was it difficult last night getting through this?
No, we slept
really.
and ate and watched the World Series. And
I think the worst is yet to come from what they're saying on the news.
And are you going to ride that out too tonight?
We're here.
Oh, yes, we're here for the duration.
Before the storm, Cara DeVoe and her 2 sons were in a homeless shelter. Now, for safety reasons, they've been moved to an evacuation shelter. Are you okay being here?
Mm-hmm.
You are. But are you worried? Are you scared about this hurricane?
Kinda.
DeVoe says she, too, was kinda scared of Hurricane Sandy, but not anymore.
We're a strong family and we'll weather right through it. So
Somehow or other.
yeah. So everything's gonna work out, right guys?
Mm-hmm.
City officials say the good news here is that no one was killed in this storm and no one was seriously injured. And Scott, they attribute that fact to the fact that people have heeded their warnings to get out of town.
Already more than 250,000 homes and businesses in the New York City area are without power. But the real concern tonight is flooding. Jim Axelrod is in Manhattan.
Well, Scott, New York City won't feel the full force of Hurricane Sandy until later tonight. Preparations are complete, but as one city official told me, quote, "We can only do so much." Everywhere you look tonight, you see sandbags in Manhattan. There are sandbags in front of closed-up subway station entrances, sandbags at Ground Zero, sandbags in front of the New York Stock Exchange. As Hurricane Sandy bears down on New York City, Saks Fifth Avenue is boarded up against fierce winds, strong enough winds to topple a crane on the 75th floor of this luxury building. And every train and subway station is closed.
It's going to be big. I mean, they just don't close mass transit for nothing.
But here at the mouth of New York Harbor, Police Commissioner Ray Kelly's top fear is everyone else's as well.
The flood is probably the biggest concern, the height of the water.
Sandy is hitting New York City at high tide, which only makes matters worse. 375,000 people living in the lowest lying areas have already been evacuated in the face of predictions for a storm surge of 6 to 12 feet. If that happens, Sandy could send crippling blasts of salt water into underground power stations. The single biggest challenge to public safety in a situation like this is what?
Blackouts, extended periods of time where we don't have power. And That's, of course, what everyone is concerned about.
New York City's subway system could be damaged as well by a flood of corrosive seawater. With a daily ridership of 5.3 million people, a disrupted subway system could carry grave economic consequences. There are many forecasts calling for a storm surge of 11, even 12 feet. If that happens, it would set a new record. The old record, a hurricane in 1821. Scott?
Elsewhere in New York City today, the financial markets were closed. They'll be closed again tomorrow. It is the first time in 27 years that the weather has shut down those financial markets. We asked Anthony Mason to tell us more about how Sandy will affect the economy.
Wall Street went silent as Sandy approached. With the New York Stock Exchange shuttered, a third of all the world's equities trading was shut down. It's the first time weather has caused a two-day closure since 1888. Preliminary estimates say Sandy could land an expensive punch on the U.S. economy, costing $20 billion or more, starting with gasoline prices.
We're pretty worried about the oil sector here. There's close to 1 million barrels per day of production that's right in the really prime target area for this storm.
Chuck Watson, Director of Research for Kinetic Analysis, says that includes 6 refineries that account for nearly 7% of the country's production capacity.
If those refineries are down for a week, 2 weeks, especially 3-4 weeks because of water damage, then it's going to have a real crimp on gas supplies in the Northeast.
Sandy's wrath is also expected to leave tens of thousands of small businesses without power for days, if not weeks. Even before Sandy arrived, the famous Fifth Avenue department store Bergdorf Goodman was boarded up. So was this Dairy Queen, losing business they may never be able to get back and costing hourly workers days of lost wages. But hurricanes have their winners, too. The path of destruction they create is followed by a rebuilding boom that provides construction jobs and stimulates the economy.
But usually there are more losers than winners, and the economic disruptions are extensive. The Department of Labor even raised the possibility it may postpone the release of the latest unemployment numbers due out on Friday.
The hurricane has also interrupted the presidential campaign. New England lobstermen fear that the storm will sink their business. Of course, there are only 8 days now until Election Day. The only thing that could stop the campaign was a hurricane. Bill Plant is at the White House.
President Obama called off a campaign stop in Florida this morning and returned to Washington, which was already feeling the sting of Hurricane Sandy. After a briefing from emergency officials, the president appeared before cameras.
This is going to be a big and powerful storm. And all across the eastern seaboard, I think everybody is taking the appropriate preparations.
He urged people in danger areas to cooperate with emergency officials.
Please listen to what your state and local officials are saying. When they tell you to evacuate, you need to evacuate. Do not delay. Don't pause. Don't question the instructions that are being given.
But he wouldn't talk about what the storm means for next week.
All right.
What about the impact on the election, sir?
I am not worried at this point about the impact on the election. I'm worried about the impact on families, and I'm worried about the impact on our first responders. I'm worried about the impact on our economy and on transportation. The election will take care of itself next week.
But, Scott, even though the president has suspended his campaign for 2 days, he may still get some benefit from just being in charge in a time of crisis. That is, as long as the government efforts don't screw up. Of course, the campaign isn't really suspended. The president has his surrogates on the road. Former President Bill Clinton spoke today in Orlando and also in Ohio, where he joined Vice President Joe Biden. Scott?
Mitt Romney also canceled his campaign events today. Jan Crawford is traveling with the Romney campaign.
Our nation, a lot of people are enduring some very difficult times. And our hearts and our prayers go to them as we think about how tough it's going to be there.
In Ohio, Romney struck a somber tone.
And so I'd like to ask you who are here today to think about making a contribution to the Red Cross or to another relief agency, to be of help if you possibly can in any way you can imagine to help those that are in harm's way.
With the race now a dead heat, Romney was hoping to build momentum in the final stretch. But the hurricane has halted the campaign. Romney canceled rallies in the toss-up states of Virginia and New Hampshire, and today he canceled a rally in Wisconsin and all of his campaign stops on Tuesday in Ohio and Iowa. Romney's local campaign offices are now accepting contributions for victims, and he's made available campaign buses to distribute supplies.
Now, Romney was in Iowa this afternoon, and he said that he was briefed by telephone with officials from FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the National Weather Service about the storm and the response efforts. And as for this election, Scott, his campaign advisors tell me they are not worried about momentum, about those polls that now have it neck and neck. They say they think this storm will just freeze the race until the campaign continues.
On this stormy day, there was a ray of sunshine on the economy. The Commerce Department reported today that consumer spending jumped 0.8% last month. That is a key indicator of the economy's pulse, and it's the biggest increase since February. Personal income was also up by 0.4%. A moment.
Going to get a direct hit or what?
Of course, folks who have to make a living from the sea are very concerned about Sandy. Seth Doan is with some fishermen in Newport, Rhode Island tonight.
We found lobsterman Jim Violet on his third trip today to the docks. Each time, he's added more lines to secure his boat.
But I decided to go home, and I started having second thoughts, decided to put a few extra ones on there just to be extra safe.
He's fished these waters off Newport, Rhode Island for 30 years.
You get used to storms, hurricanes like this?
Well, everyone's a little bit different, so yeah, you're kind of used to storms, but hurricanes always scare you, you know, so...
Why scare you?
Well, it could put you out of business, you know, could sink your boat, could damage your boat very badly and put you out of business.
And there's a ripple effect too.
Absolutely, there's a ripple effect to my suppliers, to their customers, my crew, everybody that depends on us, the fuel guy that we buy fuel from, the bait guy that we buy bait from. It hurts everybody.
Up and down the pier, trucks were lined up with fishermen monitoring their boats. Donald Snyder was one of them.
There'll be guys in and out of here all night.
Just checking to make sure everything's okay?
Yeah, I mean, something like that boat right there, that's a $200,000 boat. That's all that guy has, you know, so.
This is folks' livelihood?
Yeah, it's livelihood.
Everything's tied up in these boats?
Yep.
Jim Violet is most concerned about how slow the hurricane is predicted to move.
And this one's going to take its sweet time going by, so it's going to be pretty nasty through the whole night. It's going to be a long night, sleepless night, worrying about my boat.
Now, the real concern here at the docks is the high tide, which is expected to be particularly high tonight because of the full moon. Seth Doan, CBS News, Newport, Rhode Island.
We'll be back with an update on Hurricane Sandy in just a moment.
I'm Anthony Mason at CBS News headquarters in New York. The hurricane has knocked out our connection to Scott Pelley on the New Jersey shore. Sandy is making landfall tonight with winds up to 90 miles an hour. It has already knocked out power to nearly 1 million homes and businesses. Governors of 14 states have now declared a state of emergency. Jeff Clore is in Atlantic City with the latest. Jeff?
Anthony, good evening. We appear to be in a bit of a lull actually right now, but we're still told 85% of this city is underwater. That began when some of the first swells at high tide swallowed up 80 sections of this city's famed boardwalk this morning. Police do tell us that some people remain trapped tonight. We were out on some of those rescue missions earlier. Those rescue missions were suspended as of 4 o'clock this afternoon because police were told and firefighters were told they needed to come inside because it simply became too dangerous. Anthony?
Jeff Glore in Atlantic City. Thanks, Jeff. Some CBS stations will be leaving us now for local programming, but for many of you, this special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News will continue in a moment. Good evening, and for those of you just joining us, this is a special expanded edition. I'm Anthony Mason. Scott Pelley had been reporting from the New Jersey shore, but the hurricane has knocked out our link to him. Hurricane Sandy is about to make landfall near Atlantic City, but the impact of this storm is being felt all along the East Coast. The governors of 14 states from North Carolina to Maine have declared states of emergency. Let's get the latest now from CBS News hurricane consultant David Bernard. David?
Good evening, Anthony. And again, a lot of trouble up and down the East Coast tonight. Sandy is basically not a tropical system anymore, but the effects are all going to be the same. Let's start with where the storm is right now. And again, we are looking at very strong waves occurring all across portions of the Jersey and also Long Island Sound. Notice just offshore, we're seeing some of these wave heights still indicated near 45 feet, maybe even a little bit higher. And even though the storm is here, Anthony, it is still pushing a lot of water in from the east and southeast. In fact, I was looking at some of the tide gauges in just the last few moments, and places like the Battery and even further east along the Long Island Sound and south along the Jersey Shore, those tides are now reaching their highest levels of the day as we are nearing a high tide in the next couple of hours.
David, we've talked a lot about this strong storm surge. How exactly does it work?
When we talk about storm surge, we're talking about a lot of components that go into it. I was just mentioning high tide. So on a normal day, you have your tide ranges. You have your low tides and you have your high tides. Now, when a storm is going on, we have to also factor in the surge. Now, the surge is not like a tsunami. It's a gradual buildup of water that comes along with the center of the storm and then pushes into the coastline. So we have the sea level, the tide, and the surge. And what happens is, if it comes in at high tide like tonight, you have to add the high tide to the amount of the surge, and when you do that, that equals the total storm tide. So when we talk about water levels in Long Island Sound and along the Jersey Shore, could be anywhere from 6 to as much as 12 feet. That's what we're talking about, the storm tide, and that's how much water potentially you could expect at ground level. So if you know you're at sea level, then obviously the storm tide would equal exactly what amount of water you could have in your house.
And David, how long is the worst of this supposed to last?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, right now the storm is moving at a pretty good clip, but it looks like that low pressure center is going to slow down. And so we're going to talk about onshore winds continuing probably for the next 24 to likely 48 hours. Now, here's the satellite picture, and the center of the storm is right here. But look how the winds going counterclockwise around it are continuing to feed a lot of water, not only into Long Island Sound, but also into the Jersey Shore. And the track is going to be something like that. So we're going to continue with these onshore winds at least for the next day and probably for the next couple of days. Right here in South Florida in the Miami area, we still have large ocean swells that are causing coastal flooding here up and down the coastline, and Sandy went by several days ago.
David Bernard, thanks, David. Flooding along the New Jersey shore has cut some communities off from the mainland. You know conditions are bad when rescue crews can't even get around. Elaine Quijano has our report.
Pounding surf and rising water along the Jersey Shore had officials worried early in Point Pleasant Beach.
It's completely underwater. I'm not going to chance taking this vehicle into it.
By noon, the water was already so high, even experienced rescuers had to turn around.
Yeah, you can see how deep it is.
Kyle Grace with the city's emergency management team had a blunt warning for anyone who ignored the order to leave.
They have to realize if it gets really bad here, we cannot come in and get them. So if you can get out now, get out now.
Authorities here know how deadly storms can be. Last year, Tropical Storm Irene swept 2 people out to sea.
People need to learn from that and listen to us and get away from the ocean, get away from where the tidal flooding is going to happen.
One person who was on the beach after the evacuation order was Mike Cohen.
What are you doing here?
I came over here to check one of the complexes that I manage. I'm actually setting my pumps up and I'm leaving right now.
They are urging.
You expect high winds, heavy rain, and flooding from a hurricane, but here's what makes Sandy so unusual. It's bringing snow to the Appalachians. Anna Werner is in Elkins, West Virginia.
The National Weather Service issued blizzard warnings for more than 14 counties across the Appalachian Mountains as Hurricane Sandy hit a blanket of cold air. West Virginia's Governor Earl Ray Tomblin declared a state of emergency as the snow began to fall.
We're getting ready for the winter storm, you know.
The Snowshoe Mountain Resort was one of the first to see the snow. 4 inches now could grow to a possible 2 feet by tomorrow. Some roads are treacherous already.
Her friend's car doesn't have the greatest tires, and they've done spinning around on the road one time, so I decided just to come get them.
You'll do better.
Yeah.
You got a 4-wheel drive.
Yeah, I think so. I'll do better.
Travis Ray is with the state's Department of Transportation.
It's going to be very difficult. You know, there's going to be guys out there in midnight in zero visibility conditions. They're going to have to, work, and we have a very dependable workforce. But they're not ideal conditions for people to be out in. But we're going to be out there to serve the public.
The most critical problem here may be if the power goes out. Companies are already warning the outages could be widespread as trees buckle under the early snow and fall on power lines.
Now, Anthony, for as much snow as is coming down here now, state officials say the next 24 hours are going to be the worst. The National Guard is on standby, and power crews and extra highway crews are on alert to cope with whatever damage happens here over the next couple of days.
Anna, what can you tell us about any power outages inland there?
Well, we do know that a few thousand customers are without power in the region, but in fact, just 10 minutes ago, in the town of Elkins right here behind me, the lights in the entire town flickered twice, then the whole town went dark. Some of them have come back on, but many of the businesses here appear to be without power as we speak.
Anna Werner, thanks, Anna. As we mentioned, we lost our satellite connection to Scott Pelley, but we have him on the phone now from Allenhurst, New Jersey. Scott, you lost power where you are. What can you tell us about the conditions where you are now?
Anthony, well, I tell you the truth, I'm watching a number of refrigerators floating by in the sea right now. It's a remarkable sight here in Allenhurst. The ocean is crashing over a seawall. I'm about 15 feet above the beach of the seawall, and the waves are crashing over the top of the seawall pretty routinely now. And there's quite a bit of debris in the water, and like I said, I just watched a couple of refrigerators float by. We're seeing a lot of wood, lumber in the water. Obviously, some structures have been destroyed by the waves, and we're seeing the debris going by right now. The winds at this moment are about 69 miles an hour, according to the Weather Service, gusting up a little bit higher than that. But mostly the story here, Anthony, as David Bernard was saying earlier, it's the water. We are looking at mountainous waves, impossible to judge how tall they are, but they are crashing onto the shore here and now vaulting over this 15-foot seawall, which has been here protecting Allenhurst for quite some time. The city itself, this city, is largely dry except for the rain. We're not seeing massive flooding here at all, but certainly the waves are threatening the lower-lying areas of New Jersey, all up and down the coast here. So a very significant storm, not a great deal of rain, winds about 69 to 75 miles an hour, which would make it a Category 1 hurricane, and the sea rising and rising as the storm comes on shore. Anthony?
All right, Scott, and as we mentioned, one of the casualties of the hurricane was our live signal from Scott down there in Allenhurst, New Jersey. Today, Washington, D.C. could have been called Washington CD, as in closed down. Wyatt Andrews is there. Wyatt?
Anthony, Washington, D.C. is 120 miles from the Atlantic coastline from where Scott is reporting, and yet hurricane-force winds are still expected here. The threat of wind and flooding shut down most of the nation's capital today and will again tomorrow. Fear of Hurricane Sandy emptied the streets of Washington. More than 200,000 non-emergency federal workers were told to stay home. Schools were closed. The entire subway system was closed. The executive branch was mostly closed. Congress was already on recess. Only the Supreme Court was fully on the job, hearing 2 cases, one on wiretapping, the other on copyright limitations. But the court and the rest of the government will be closed on Tuesday. The #1 concern tonight is the danger from the wind. The Weather Service issued an unusual high wind warning for Washington and Baltimore and is forecasting hurricane-force gusts of 75 miles per hour tonight. Almost 6 million people live in the Washington region, and the threat of downed trees and lost electric power is extreme. Hundreds of utility repair trucks and crews from outside the area have been brought in and pre-positioned, but can only begin the repair work after the storm subsides. The power companies serving the Washington region say that 100,000 homes are already without power, and that's before these heavy hurricane-force winds begin slamming this region later tonight. Anthony?
Wyatt, when does it look like the Capitol will be open for business again?
Anthony, just before we came out here, the federal government announced that yet again, federal employees here, and there are 300,000 of them, roughly 100,000 are emergency workers, but they're all being asked to stay home again tomorrow, and so Wednesday at the earliest.
Thanks, Wyatt. In New York City, a construction crane snapped today in the high winds and was left dangling 75 stories above the street. It's a precarious situation, and John Miller's been looking into it. John?
Well, Anthony, I'm just back from the scene, and what you have there was hard to believe when you saw it. You have a crane that is at the top of a 90-story building that is in the process of being built. This is on West 57th Street, just down the street from our broadcast center here, and this is the street that is home to Carnegie Hall, the iconic Russian tea room, the Steinway piano factory, and of course all of it's been evacuated because the boom on that crane snapped off and is hanging over the street. Now, authorities say if the rest of it breaks loose, it could fall at such a velocity and hit with such an impact, it could pierce the pavement, it could hit gas lines, water mains, steam lines, and cause real disaster. So it's not a disaster yet, it's a kind of a disaster waiting to happen. What they're hoping is that it won't, that they can tie steel cables to that boom, reattach it to the building, wait till after the storm passes, and then dismantle it and take it down in a million pieces. But right now, a main thoroughfare shut down, a precarious situation still unfolding as the storm approaches.
And I assume, John, they don't want to send anyone up there right now to try to secure it.
No, that was part of the early discussion, and they said, you know, the risk to people right now, that boom is still attached to the cables that run to the crane housing, and they're hoping that all of that will hold it. In the meantime, they're just counting on the evacuation to keep everybody safe.
But the worst of the winds are still to come.
That's right.
John Miller, thanks. To the east of New York City, Long Island is getting hit with a storm surge. Streets are flooded and more than 525,000 homes and businesses have lost power. Michelle Miller is in Sag Harbor.
By noon, Sandy's storm surge had already wiped out the laser-thin beach in Sag Harbor. Police Chief Tom Fabiano was stunned.
How far did the beach go out?
70, probably 100 feet out now, the beach here.
There's nothing left.
No, there's nothing left here. As you can see behind us, there's a playground, and as I said, all the years I've been here, I've never seen it come up to the road or anything like that.
Flooding is the chief's main concern, but he says the winds are proving just as dangerous. Strong waves stripped boats off their moorings, and well-rooted trees were toppled. There is a voluntary evacuation order in low-lying areas here.
Have you ever seen it this bad?
No, I haven't. I've been here 35 years doing this job, and this is not even the worst of it.
At this bar across the street from the harbor, the power was already out, but people were trying to squeeze in a last-minute meal.
It's pretty impressive to watch what's going on outside from here. You have to be concerned and you have to be careful. You got to stay away from the hysteria, too.
And Anthony, the corner bar and every other business here is shut down tonight, and 3/4 of this town are without power. A few people are milling on the streets, milling about, but most of the people are heeding the warning from the police chief to buckle up and ride out this storm.
Michelle Miller in Sag Harbor. Thank you, Michelle. Further west, Jim Axelrod is in downtown Manhattan tonight at the Battery on the tip of Manhattan. Jim, what's the latest there?
Well, Anthony, just within the last hour, the rain has really started to intensify. The wind has picked up. You can hear a sound as the wind whips through the skyscrapers of lower Manhattan that sounds like a jet engine. And it seems as though New York is really about to feel the full force of Hurricane Sandy. The big concern is the water right over my shoulder. All eyes are on the seawall. If that water comes up over the seawall and works its way into the electricity generating equipment that's in Lower Manhattan and into the subway stations in Lower Manhattan, there could be very serious implications. Anthony?
All right, Jim Axelrod. Thanks, Jim. There was a dramatic rescue at sea aboard a ship you may recognize from the movies. And 2 presidential campaigns are derailed by a hurricane. That's just ahead. The hurricane forced the presidential candidates to suspend their campaigning for a couple of days. John Dickerson is our political director. John, with just a week till Election Day, how is this going to affect their campaigns?
Well, no candidate wants to look like he's taking political advantage of this crisis. So with a week before the election, this should be a time of frantic political activity. But now the campaigns have to pare way back and calibrate every political move. Usually at this time, the campaigns are trying to hone their message down to a single, simple closing argument to punch through to voters. But that's been interrupted and complicated now. Both men have canceled a series of campaign events. The president has an official role, and his strategists are trying to both highlight that role while at the same time not looking like they're doing so. Mitt Romney has no official role, but by turning his campaign into a relief effort shows he cares, and it keeps him in the news at this key time. Losing the candidate on the stump is a blow to both campaigns in the battleground states, where a candidate visit is an important part of the organization. It gets the candidate's message into local media where undecided voters can hear it, and candidate events lure voters who can then be taken after the rally to vote early or convinced to volunteer for the final get-out-the-vote effort. But while the candidates have suspended their public events for a little bit, the race does still continue. Both campaigns were kicking each other under the table today in Ohio over the auto bailout, releasing competing television ads and accusations.
So, John, how is this likely to affect the ground organization for both candidates in the key battleground states you were talking about?
Well, they'll continue fighting it out on the ground while the candidates are not there. But there is this element of, without the candidates coming to pay a visit, the campaigns have to rely on surrogates to come. And surrogates just don't turn out the crowds as much. In some states, the crucial battleground state of Virginia, and then also perhaps a little bit in North Carolina, the ground game kind of has to halt in terms of just the fact that the weather is too bad, and also because volunteers are busy cleaning up their basements and their front yards, and they're not able to get on the phone and call voters to try and convince them to vote for their candidate.
All right, John Dickerson. Thanks, John. The deadly meningitis outbreak caused by tainted steroid injections has spread to 19 states. Rhode Island was added to the list today. The number of cases jumped to 347. 25 people have died. And another drug mixing company in Massachusetts called Infusion Resource was ordered to shut down after investigators made a surprise inspection. Lights, camera, Coast Guard. A ship straight out of Hollywood is sunk by the hurricane. Next. A ship that was used in the 1962 film Mutiny on the Bounty was at the center of a real-life drama today. The ship was battered by Hurricane Sandy and sank. The crew had to be rescued. David Martin has the story.
Coast Guard rescue swimmer Dan Todd was lowered into 18-foot seas 90 miles off the coast of North Carolina.
Swimmer's going into the water.
He swam to one of 2 life rafts holding 14 survivors. The 3-masted ship HMS Bounty was sailing from Connecticut to Florida when it foundered. The Coast Guard located the life rafts by homing in on their emergency beacons. What followed was the rescue of 14 souls from vessels pitching so violently that at times they capsized. One after another, the crew members wearing cold water survival suits and life jackets were pulled aboard in the wildly swinging cage.
This one's swinging really bad.
The swimmer remained in the water, waiting for the empty cage to be lowered for another rescue. At one point, he moved from one raft to the other by dangling beneath the helicopter.
Stop the wind. I'm not swinging Dan too much. No, I stopped him. I think I threw my shoulder at him.
As the last survivor was hoisted aboard, the pilot was already making plans to refuel as soon as they landed, to head back out and search for 2 crew members still missing.
Let's just go to Cherry Point, drop some people off. Hot gas and come back.
Some of the survivors suffered injuries, but none were life-threatening. The body of one of the two missing crew members has now been found. The captain of the HMS Bounty is still missing.
David, how long can he be likely to survive in those waters, do you think?
The cold water survival gear they were wearing is supposed to enable you to survive for about 15 hours. The ship sank in the early morning hours, so those 15 hours are about up.
All right, David Martin, thanks. We'll have an update on Hurricane Sandy when this special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News continues. Updating our top story, Sandy is making landfall tonight on the New Jersey shore near Atlantic City. It is no longer a hurricane, but it is still a dangerous storm. 14 states have declared states of emergency. Power is out for more than 1 million homes and businesses. Flooding is a major concern. New York Harbor could see a storm surge of up to 11 feet, enough to flood lower Manhattan. Gale warnings are up along the Great Lakes as Sandy moves inland, and as much as 3 feet of snow is predicted for the mountains of West Virginia. Financial markets in New York will be closed again tomorrow, as will federal government offices in Washington. And airlines have canceled more than 13,000 flights through tomorrow. And that's our special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News. Stay with this CBS station and CBSNews.com for the latest on the storm. For Scott Pelley, I'm Anthony Mason. Thanks for watching. Good night.